I always think you should under-promise and over-deliver, but I can tell you, you're going to love this webinar. Kevin has so many fascinating and really applicable examples to share with all of us. So I think everybody's really going to enjoy it. So we're going to go ahead and formally get started. I'm Michelle Bono with 3CMA, and I want to welcome you to our 3CMA webinar series. This one's entitled What and Who You Are Listening To, and it's about using the right input for important decisions. I hope some of you have met Kevin at 3CMA conferences. I know some of you all also have met Kevin when he presented at TCU in the Public Communicators program, because that's who said to us, everybody needs to hear this guy. So again, he's the chief scientist with Governance Sciences Group. He has founded that organization. You've seen his resume and all of his background. Super smart guy, a couple master's degrees, worked on some PhDs, more than one. He loves this business of statistics, and I love his message that he has learned about it so we don't have to, at least not to the extent that he has. So Kevin, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to you. I want to remind everybody of a couple quick things. Please feel free to send in questions. If I can ask them while Kevin's still on the topic, I will. If not, we'll wait and ask them at the end. You can also use the chat function. I'll be monitoring that as well. Someone always asks, will these slides be available? Kevin has a lot of slides. They will be available on the 3CMA website likely by tomorrow. So we will have those slides available to you as well under the webinar link on the 3CMA website. So without further ado, Kevin Lyons.
Great. Well, thanks, Michelle. Thanks for inviting me to give the talk. Big fan of 3CMA, great people there, and I'm sure great people attending today. So I'll jump in. I'll give you a little bit of idea where we're headed. So we're going to start out. I'm going to try to justify why you might give a crap about data, frankly. You know, how it might be useful to you. And then we'll jump into the COVID data and pick a few lessons out of what's happened with that data that you can use generally. From there, we'll go really more into your wheelhouse, the science of public input, you know, local governments, how it works, how the whole system machine fits together. And then we'll talk about getting the right data. And after that, hopefully we'll have 10 minutes is actually probably the target for Q&A, and ask me anything, your own specific challenges, problems, anything you can think of, relevant or not to the topic. I'm excited for that. That's always my favorite part. So, data. Well, let me tell you about one way to move rocks. If you had a quarantine project, mine was actually, I live in a rocky, downhill, no yard, backyard. So I started picking up some rocks and moving them around. Turns out that rocks get pretty big and pretty heavy quickly. And I learned this interesting fact, gave me an idea that any idiot can rent an excavator for a few $100s. Here's proof. And it turns out that I essentially went from working harder to smarter when I got that excavator because of that little data. We all know working harder versus smarter. You think I'm going to say, yeah, we should all work smarter. Hold that thought. So harder, yeah. 1 extra hour, you get 1 extra hour. That's good. It's great, actually. That's how you get a yard created. Smarter, even better. That time you spend figuring out about the excavator or other things, wow. I mean, not only do you do more work, but the whole project can expand. And in the government context, just to take one example, great outfit, Denver Peak Academy out of the city of Denver, they teach their employees how to innovate. And they've invested $4.8 million in the program, and they've saved $15 million over 4 years. So that time spent working on your job as opposed to working at your job is really valuable. Let me give you another concept we call working wiser. And so if you got sort of more time and effort versus better processes, what about better knowledge and judgment? What can you do with that? How does that stack up? Well, here's an example. First survey we ever did, where the data from that survey saved $7 million by changing what they knew about the decision. So that's a 1,000x return compared to a 3x return. It's kind of mind-boggling, and I was hooked at that point. So how does that work? Well, again, it's just better data for better decisions, shifting what you think the right decision is to what the right decision actually is. And in my case, I got one key piece of data when I started working on the yard, and that was to put in a trampoline. Who knew how great that was going to be during quarantine? And it was about the price of an excavator, a few $100. Amazing. Okay, so how is input going to be useful to you? This input data, there's the wiser what to do, and that's community preference. That's what we're talking about. Got to know what that is. And then there's also how to do it. There's facts and ideas and feedback that you can get from a broad base of people who might have some really localized knowledge that's helpful. Okay. 2 challenges to keep in mind, of course. 5 out of 4 Americans do not understand statistics. It's a fact. No, it's not a fact. It highlights that we're just not natural statisticians. And similarly, we're misled by what we see in front of us with our own eyes. As the great Chico Marx said when he was caught cheating in a movie, well, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes, right? So, of course, we're going to believe the voices we're hearing and seeing and right in front of us, and it's going to feel like the whole world, but it's not. And that's really important. All right. So let's talk about first poll, which I guess I'm going to start here. Ready, boom. So think about, don't look it up or anything, just your impression right now. What's your chance of dying if you got COVID for 1,000 people, random chance? Excellent. All right, cool. We got 40 something in right now. I usually knock these off after about a minute. And one interesting thing is, by the way, once the numbers start coming in, they don't change much after a while. That's the beauty of statistics. All right, we got almost 87% participation in a minute. Cool, I'm going to end the polling, and we're going to hold that thought. All right, we got a bunch of answers over 1 to 5%, a bunch of answers 0.5%. So it looks like most people are actually under 0.5. I'm about to see some wisdom of the crowd, I think. Cool. So for those of you who took the higher number, this might be what you thought of doing. Certain number of deaths, certain number of cases, and just divide them, 6%. But hold on a second. Who's actually been tested? Has everyone been tested? Or if you remember early on, you had to be sick, and not just sick, but very sick to get tested. And then it kind of expanded out to people who had been exposed by someone who'd been confirmed, and then eventually some volunteers. So the question you have to ask in this sample, just like any sample, if you do this throughout your life, whenever you see data, a sample of data, are the people in my sample the same as the people not in my sample? And how might they be different? In this case, we've kind of already hinted at it, right? Sick people are not representative of the population, fortunately. Exposed people, again, same problem. Volunteers, there's something about why they volunteer that makes it interesting. Probably know what you'd really like is a random sample. And sure enough, if you want to know the true infection fatality rate, the number of people who catch it and then die, you need to know all infections. So random sample that is not related to the positive test results. It's an uncorrelated sample. Correlated is a fancy way of saying co-related. Two things that go together, they move together in the same direction. So the test is, have you ever had COVID? A random sample is the population, and sure enough, in April, the first antibody test was done. They found 50 to 85 times more cases than had been confirmed. Whoa, mind-boggling, right? Their sample, they found 3% positive test results compared to 0.15 of the county, which is the 1,000 cases. In both cases, you can think of the deaths are the same, confirmed deaths. So that means in one case, you have that 5% case fatality rate that we saw in the beginning for the US, or 0.1. So right now, the people who picked 0.1 are feeling pretty good, right? Well, okay, so the bad news is only 3% are infected if that data is good. Much left to go. The good news is 0.1% is the same as seasonal flu. That's all it is. Okay. But hold on a sec. 3,300 volunteers for the test were recruited from Facebook ads? Are you telling me they used the same methodology as a Facebook poll? And I'm sure you know you wouldn't trust a Facebook poll for anything maybe than picking ice cream colors, flavors among friends. So yeah, they sampled like a Facebook poll. And they got destroyed for this. One of the top metadata people at Stanford had his name on the paper, and his reputation may be ruined for a very long time. Don't make statisticians angry. The authors owe us all apology is what happened with that. And that's how your community feels when you use bad data as well. You know, they feel like something's wrong. In this case, these people got chewed up on social media. So in both cases, you have samples bias by self-selection is really the way to think about it. In the sample is different from outside the sample. One case, the infection fatality rate, the IFR, is too high, and the other one ends up too low. Too many positives compared to the overall population. People volunteered because maybe they thought they might have it and they wanted to test, or they wondered if they'd already have it.
Kevin, I just want to mention one of our attendees already said before you announced it, said, wait a minute, that's been debunked. So you got a smart group.
Beautiful. Here. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that was an early one. So in fact, the CDC came out with an estimate recently, 0.26 of all people, 0.4 of those with symptoms. And I think that one's getting a little debunked, frankly. My best guess is 0.3 to 0.5. And if you're curious and you want to look, here's why. There's a ton of antibody tests out there that have been done. And there's some good ones. So the answer, best as we can tell, 0.2 to 0.5. And what's really interesting is in a crowd your size, that's pretty much where your median answer showed up, which was surprising to me, actually, but not really if you think of the wisdom of crowds, which is where community input comes in. Cool. By the way, guess who else was off? The World Health Organization, 3.4% was their guess back in March, which is not good. Professionals make mistakes too. So, self-selection makes COVID data unusable and public input data too. Think about that relation. Now we'll talk about second issue, which is aggregating data. So what does that 0.26 mean for you personally, assuming it's true? Think about that. Is that your risk of dying? No, it doesn't mean almost anything. That's what scary is. Why? Well, it turns out if you look at it by age, and I did this at the end of March because I was curious and I have an 83-year-old father. Wow, what a difference. I mean, the change from the young folks to the old folks, and this is the case fatality rate, by the way, at the time. So figure the infection fatality rate, roughly that 10 times lower, but it goes up off and hard up to the right by age. So which box you're in matters a lot. In fact, the CDC finally has come out with an estimate that if you're over 65, you have a 1% risk. If you're under 50, 0.03. But as you can see, even that doesn't tell you with a story for over 65. Okay, so 30 times the spread from under 50 to 65 and older. And if you look at my data, 30 to 80, 150 times the risk. So if you just look at that one blob number of 0.26, you've learned almost nothing. You need age. So you need to disaggregate the data. You need to get inside the blob to actually have the decision support level of information, not just like a polling number. And there's other information hidden there. If you look at that, remember that deaths number, 40 and up's about half the population. Guess how many people have died in the 40 and up? Well, 0.5% is below 40. 99.5 is above. So 99.5% of that 97,000 back at the end of May is 40 and up. And actually only 5% is below 60. So there's really, that risk compounds when you multiply it by the number of people and you get this incredible skew. Interesting thing, just like you guys had a pretty good handle on the rate, people actually seem to know the age risk. This is from a survey we did. You know, we asked comparing essentially financial health and physical health as concerns. What is your biggest concern? And if you break it down by age, the bottom three groups are pretty similar, and they're kind of like, yeah, they both suck. But the 61 and over, 3-to-1 difference. Caring about physical health, being concerned about physical health versus the older. And the crazy thing is, if you just look at the blob, it's a different story. You don't see it. You think everyone cares about physical health more. That's not the case. Okay, so overaggregation creates confusion about COVID risks and about community needs. as well. So one last thing on the COVID data, context. We've got a quiz coming up here. So which disease disproportionately affects older people and has a 120-day mortality rate of 1%? And by that, that means within 120 days, if you have it, you are deceased. Okay, everyone's going with the flu. All right, I'm going to kill it in a couple of seconds. No one picked other, by the way. Everyone was pretty confident because I framed the choices with 4. So, looks like flu is number 1, heart attack was number 2, dementia was number 3, and cancer was number 4. Here is the answer. Turning 75, just being alive at 75 means you have a 120 mortality rate of 1%. A little mind-boggling. And this was part of my research back at the end of March that I was sharing with people involved in this conversation. I looked at the actual...
Kevin, for the record, someone did note, hey, that's not really a disease. There we go.
Fair enough.
Good point.
Good point. Yes, that's good.
It shows us how easy it is to skew the data. There we go.
Yeah, that was deliberate. It was a little.
It was a trick. Well, yeah,
it was a trick. But no, it's for context, right? And by the way, the poll's clear now, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I pulled up the actuarial data, and this is actually what just being alive looks like. Put yourself in a bracket. It's dramatic. And in fact, if you look at this graph relative to the COVID case fatality graph, the blue line and this line, they're really similar, actually. Not totally similar. This is logarithmic, which you probably all learned about because of the pandemic. But you can actually just divide one by the other. And if you look by age, the increased risk, so going from just being alive to getting COVID and then are you alive in 30 days, is an interesting story. It turns out that, and the data is super noisy, but the youngest might have the highest increased risk. Still low overall, similar to these. And sure enough, it's that older group where there is an increase. But now we're talking about risks that aren't ridiculously off the chart, at least for the younger folks. So for context, motorcycle risk is 35 times higher than car driving. Some people do it. They assume that risk. Same with farming, fishing, or logging, where you get in that same range, 7x to 28x. So actually, it turns out that those increased risk are not that unreasonable for younger people, kind of crazy people that drive motorcycles. I had a scooter in grad school. So just to be clear, though, that risk thing, it's still not just the flu. And seasonal flu, we've talked about 0.1 is the infection fatality rate. As of Monday, we already had 17,000 deaths in New York out of 8.4 million in New York City, which is a 0.2 population fatality rate. And obviously, you can't do lower than that as an infection fatality rate. In fact, they have done an antibody test, and it seems like 0.5 is their best estimate right now. And if you look at even a simple crude number like excess deaths in Europe, you can see a spike. You see seasonal illnesses every winter, every year, and then boom, and that's a real thing. So, yeah, 3 to 5 times as deadly as the flu. And then one other thing, 2 times as many targets. Turns out that 50% of people actually get a vaccination for the flu every year, which means there's only 150 million, which actually means there's only another 10% before you get to that herd immunity, roughly 10 to 20%. And it is actually deadlier for older age groups. And this is how we failed. And the good data actually told us to overprotect the elderly and the sick. And in the US, 42% of deaths have been in nursing homes, even though it's only 0.6 of the population. And it's not just us. You've heard stories about people being sent to nursing homes sick. Canada, Sweden, others. Canada, it's 81% of deaths, 1.2 of the population. So jurisdictions, unfortunately, miss this data in context, and it costs lives. So, yeah, the wrong data or context can lead to COVID missteps and, in the community input, bad agency decisions. On to a happier topic, which is community input. So one quick poll that we're gonna sit on for a while here. Cool, so we're getting the middle choice is kind of the runaway right now, it looks like. Most people said, you know, probably not great, but better than nothing. Some people said, actually second place, good data, glad we can get it, and then bad data, and not sure. There's wisdom there. That's always a good answer, actually. I try to use it more, but not as much as I should. Okay, great. We'll give you an answer at the very end for this one. And as we get into input, real quick, just want to focus on, it's an interesting word. It started out as a sum of cash, then it became energy, and now it's data fed into a machine. That's what we're going to focus on today. And to kick that off, let's talk about the machine that is government communications. So we all know kind of the basic idea of a chart, supervisor, boss. Pretty simple. Do X, you hire a plumber, fix my toilet. Okay, we did it. We fixed the toilet, right? And this is actually standard communications loop and complete communications loop. Now, think about government. Why we set up governments, right? Thousands of citizens get together, do stuff. Gets a little complicated. How do you do X and did X? Well, it kind of reminds me of like when my daughter says, hey, Google, play Ariana Grande. And I say, hey, Google, stop. And Google doesn't know what to do, right? There's like, how do you 10,000 people tell someone to do something? So that doesn't work. So we actually appoint some people. In the 400-year-old towns where I grew up, it's called a select board. You select some people to be the actual voice. Now that solves one problem, but it creates others. Now you got to have more communications. Now you got to have citizens to the board to the staff. Of course, there's more than one staff, so they got to talk with each other. And then they got to go report to the board, but then they also have to, the board has to report back to the citizens. Oh gosh, there's more than one citizen, right? So you have this gigantic loop, and those are all the pieces. Now, each piece does a certain thing. We know what it is. There's a functional framework. Too much stuff, right? Good. Yeah, we're going to ignore that. We're going to focus on the two pieces that are from the community to the staff and to the board. And those actually are pretty simple, right? One is essentially give direction and feedback on the broad public needs, interests, and priorities. What do we want? What do we need? What do we value? And then to the staff, you know, you don't want citizens telling staff what to do, just like you don't want individual board members telling staff what to do. You can't spend money public money unilaterally. But give feedback, suggestions, how did this service work out? There's a pothole over here. That's useful stuff. There's also a bunch of different ways to do that now. So in the old days, back to my 400-year-old government, year public meeting at 8 in the forenoon. They still use all these words, by the way. It's pretty funny. And that was it. Nowadays, we have a ton of different options. Maybe too many, figuring out what's good for what. Hopefully I'll help you with that today. First, you can just think about what am I doing with this? Is it outbound or inbound? Is it government to one person, government to many? Is it one person to the government or many to the gov? Those are the four categories. You know, the old ways, you know, the messenger, mail letters. Think of like till the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Town crier was a real thing, by the way. Mass mailing, newspaper posts. These are pretty old technologies that have worked going back hundreds of years. Now we have email, social media, text, live stream, all that stuff. We've also had a lot of ways to do input. You know, classic elections, of course, meetings, letters, phone calls this century. That's nice. Scientific surveys since the 30s. Thanks, Mr. Gallup. But now new tools. Obviously, again, email, mobile apps, 311 apps, you know, online forums, engagement forums for individuals, surveys, petitions, and scientific panels to get scientific survey data. Okay, so the neat thing is, if you actually boil all this down to many to gov, it's really only one thing. There's not much going on there. And that's a little bit of a problem, because even within that, it turns out there's not a lot of ways to get valid data. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that's important, and maybe we should put a little more attention there. So Why do we need community input? You can get by without it, maybe, right? Here's a citizen perspective. So put your citizen hat on now. And we've tested this actually with tons of citizens. Which org chart would you rather be in? So you got citizens on the top, government on the bottom, government and citizens. I don't need to poll you for this because we know everyone's A, everyone that takes this poll. Here's another one. Which org chart is democracy? And again, we're familiar with kind of the difference, the goal, the ideal of democracy, it's A. Everyone gets that right, actually. They might say, well, what do you mean, for real or not? So which org chart feels most like reality? Yeah, guess what everyone says, kind of what you're saying, right? B. Weird. So it's supposed to be like this, but it's like this. Okay, so this is the one. Which org chart's established by law? I was kind of cheating to ask you guys this because you know the answer, but this is what the citizen perspective is. They're kind of confused. Like, whoa, wait a minute, it's supposed to be like A, but it feels like B. So why does that happen? We all want A to be reality. I've been a public official for 6 years, advisory board, look up at my public masters. And gosh, I wish they'd just give me a lot more input. So, you're like, we'll do what you want, what y'all want. But what do you want us to do, right? You are just doing what you want. Because that unrepresentative input from a few of these people, the individual input you're getting, that feels like community input, leads to bad decisions. That's where representative input can solve the problem. And so one of my favorite citizen perspectives is essentially American people hire high-powered lobbyists to push interests in Congress. Thanks to the Onion for that. The sentiment, though, is what we hear pretty much from residents. They're not serving our interests, they're serving special interests. That's at all levels of government, and we can fix that. We can do better. Here's another perspective. I accidentally refer to this as performance art, which I hope it isn't, but some artist created this two-level outhouse, politicians on the top and voters at the top, and that captures how people can feel when they're in that situation where they feel like the community is not being served first. Okay, so your perspective now. You're in a position where you could probably use some input. Just think about now, take this as an exercise. If 10,000 people chip in for pizza and you have to figure out which toppings to get, what are you going to do? How do you figure this out? How do you figure out what people want? Which of these work? Order what you want? No, you're just a jerk, right? So no, ask your friends what they want? Well, no, you're like a jerk, and now I don't like your friends either. So, okay, so now those are, we call those corruption, basically, in government. Call a meeting. I mean, if you want the anchovy people to show up, and then 9 out of 10 people want anchovies, and then you do data-driven decisions and get 90% anchovy pizzas, congratulations. Yeah, that's not going to work very well. Same thing with social media. Friends of Pineapple Pizza are going to show up and take over. Online engagement forum, guess who's going to share that post with people? Online survey, who's going to invite their friends? Who's going to share it, right? Yeah, we know these are all terrible ideas. You'd never do this. You kind of know the right answer too, right? Those are all unrepresentative. But we do those in government, unfortunately. The best answer is to take everyone's order. It's actually close to what an election is supposed to be. But there's another good answer, which also gives you a good representative sample to make decisions. That's a scientific survey of orders. Okay, so why representative input? Why governments need it? Here's an example. Very first survey we did. A friend on the board was thinking about a garbage change, and hey, what's going on? What do people think of this? A majority are in favor and the rest don't give a crap. Literally what he said. He said, hey, you want to survey it? Yeah, great, perfect. Found out a majority was not in favor. In fact, people did give a crap, and they gave a crap that they didn't like the change, and it was for reasons we hadn't thought of. They figured out things, non-obvious flaws, including that half the town didn't have garages. I have a garage, a friend had a garage, the rest of the board had a garage. We basically had a gigantic garage equity problem where we had no idea that people didn't have a place to store these things, and they suggested other alternatives. So it wasn't just the how many, it was the how. And that data changed the decision. The board unanimously voted against the policy. They avoided 10-year contract of unwanted service and saved residents $7 million. You may recognize that that was the example under Wiser from the very beginning. So that's interesting, right? You kind of already knew that. Why would citizens need representative community input? And why would they want it? Not just for their own interest, but why would they want to know what everyone else thinks? This is our last poll. I want you to think about 1972 in the South and what percent of whites do you think favored segregation? Take a guess. The poll is live.
And this is not just for those of us who were born before 1972. Everybody gets to share an opinion.
Everybody. And it would be great to see the responses by age here, but we don't have that capability.
I meant to tell everyone too, our polls are anonymous. So when you, we set it up that way. So whatever you pick on all of these, we don't know who you are.
Yep. And they're not graded either. So I don't care what you say. Yeah.
And there is not a trick question here.
Good call. Fair enough. All right. So we've got our very nice 80% response rate, representative sample of our sample. And it looks like most people are in the 21 to 40 range as a single choice. There's a ton of people, 40 to 60, 61 to 80. I think I asked you, Michelle, what did you say? Were you in the 80 range or something?
I was 61 to 80, yeah.
Okay, so a few 0 to 20. Okay. So what percent of whites favored segregation in 1972? It was only 4 years after the civil rights. And then what percent of whites believe the majority of whites in their area favored segregation? Think about that in your head right now, too. A higher number, of course. Well, here's the right answer. From an actual survey someone did back then. 15%. Only 15% of whites favored segregation. But if you ask them, do they believe a majority of whites in their area favored segregation? The answer was 72%. So because of that noise, because of what was in the newspapers, people protesting, people against this, they looked around and that was what they felt. That was their experience. And no one wanted segregation. 15%. It's a horrible thought that because of this data wasn't available, something like this went on for obviously decades beyond when people wanted any part of it. And it's very similar, I would argue, to police today. I don't think anyone wants this stuff, but it's kind of been going on. And we'll show you some data on that too. The general challenge, however, is in your community, who are you going to hear from? If this was an in-person, you'd be yelling at me, the edges or the people that hate stuff, right? Yeah, that's who you usually hear from. And what does that tell you? Does it tell you, oh my gosh, that's the tip of the iceberg? That's what it feels like. That's what it felt like in the South in 1972. Or does it tell you this? Are they the outliers? Are they the crazy? No, you don't know. You just don't know. But you know what it feels like? Like you feel like the pressure. That's all you hear from. That is your universe. And you really are missing that representative reality, which can change everything. We've actually been lucky enough to have some examples where we've measured the perception from the perceived reality and compare that with representative reality from better data. And here are some of those. This is how it really works. So you're running your parks, you cut back on maintenance for your budget, have to, and you get nothing but complaints. People hate your parks, your morale in your department is crushed. And then you find out, you do a survey. Do people really hate our parks? No, they love, literally 4.0 out of 5. This is the actual reality that was out there. And morale improved overnight. But they didn't know. How could they? It's our first school survey, so they'd gotten a lot of feedback on sex ed curriculum. I mean, super hot topic. We dove right in. And people come to meetings and they totally against it, or they totally love it in a way that maybe is even a little uncomfortable. And they had a survey too. They did a survey on a particular primate-themed platform, and they sent it to parents, and they got data. And this is what it looked like. Like the opposite of a bell curve. Call it a barbell distribution. Like everyone hated it, or they didn't. This is strongly disagree. Strongly agree. What do you think reality looked like? It was amazing. It's actually a really tight distribution. Everything was pretty much between 85 and 95% support for the curriculum. When we got a scientific panel sample of parents instead. So to go a little more recent on perception lockdown protests, remember those? All right, well, does everyone want the economy to open up right away? 38%, that's not insignificant. They're worried about things will open up too slowly and the economy will get worse. Or things open too fast and the outbreak will get worse. It turns out they were a minority. So there was support, but not an iceberg. Police, anti-racism protests, super recent. I don't know if it feels different to you. It does to me. And turns out that perception, whether you feel like it was or wasn't, it actually is tip of an iceberg. Are they justified? And 82% justified or fully justified. Now, they're not apples to apples here with the two surveys, but that kind of data is really helpful because you can see where you are. So one last question you might have is, how quickly does input go bad? Well, one rule of thumb is the hotter the topic, the worse the input, and the faster it goes bad. I'm going to take a break from talking to show you a little video for 1 minute. And here we go. Grab some water. So in parallel, we have the scientific sample and the open engagement sample. Broke it down by hour and looked at how it changed in each batch. It was amazing. Sorry, that's a pitch. Ignore it. There you go. Had to get the joke in though. All right. So it's pretty dramatic, actually. And in that case, it was 10 minutes, and we've seen it elsewhere. You get this engagement sample, it's very different. One last thing you might be thinking about, can we just get away with no data? Can we just go back, maybe head in the sand and ignore what people think? Well, sort of, except you kind of can't because of all the technology, social media, it's in your face. And that little bit of data that you do get, that public input, how often is it misleading? Well, the dozen or so cases we've been able to get before and after, usually. Almost always, actually. Unfortunately, it's almost the opposite of what people actually think in your community, those noisy few. And if you want another data point, what percentage of upgrades by Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, these super big companies, smart people, trying to do a good job, how many of those are not improvements? They're good enough to build, they test them. What do you think? It's not 100%. It's actually 50%. So that's of all the stuff they've sorted through. Also true of investors, and try to pick the best companies in the world. They can pick through 10,000. The ones they pick, they're wrong 80% of the time. So guessing doesn't work either. Okay, so you get the problem, the opportunity. Obviously, we need to make more decisions with data. We need good data to make good decisions. let's talk about how to get good data.
Kevin, time frame wise, we've got about 10 minutes. It'll leave us 5 for questions.
Okay, perfect. So there's 2 types of helpful data, actually, that you can get. And alluded to them earlier. There's that community preferences, true community preferences, and then there's facts, ideas, feedback. You know, hey, moron, get a excavator, right? So those are the only 2 flavors, it turns out. You got your individual facts and ideas, and you have your community preferences. And everything else is noise. And that's the hardest thing. The biggest skill you can come away with is knowing how to tune it out. So if you want to think about facts and opinions, came up with this kind of goofy little chart, but it's stacked by value. So facts about opinions, that's essentially your scientific, your true community preference. That's great to have. You need that. Facts about facts. Hey, there's a pothole over here, or there's something else going wrong over here. That's good stuff. You can take it immediately, turn on it. Opinions about facts, things that people say that might not be true. Ever seen those? It's like most of what you get, unfortunately, on social media, especially Nextdoor. By the way, please check out Best of Nextdoor if you've never heard of it. I give that gift every time I give a talk. You will appreciate it. And then opinions about opinions, of course, that's just, the community wants this or no one likes this, garbage. So both of these top ones, the green smiley faces can be helpful. Usually it's community preferences at the level of what to do in individual facts, but don't forget there can also be interesting suggestions can come out of that. And also at the staff level, there could be preferences can be really helpful to you as well. So when do you need it? Well, look, if I say, hey, do you want something that is awesome? You go, yeah. I say, do you want to pay more taxes? You go, no. It didn't combine the 2. Okay. Do you want to pay for something awesome? Maybe. Right? What's the awesome thing? How much does it cost? It's that simple a lot of the times for your community, right? So pay more, get less? No, I don't want that. Pay less, get more? Yeah, duh, go, right? But in them trade-off land, pay a little more, get a little more. Community center, park, whatever it is. Pay less, get less. Maybe it's recycling, giving up on something. Ask about the trash. That's where you need the community input. That's where no one knows along this diagonal other than the residents. You need to aggregate that data in wise ways. So as an example, recycling costs have been rising around the country, and we have customers who want to do things like, hey, do you want to pay more, keep service the same, pay the same, but do more sorting yourself, pay the same, cut it from weekly to 2 weeks, or give it up. So they're all in trade-off land. Turns out this is what we see. Most of them are actually, they really like recycling. They're willing to do it, take on more themselves to save the money. Okay, so how not to get valid preference data? Well, you got to have unbiased responses. These are your keys. Uncorrelated, not self-selected, high response rate, blah, blah, blah. Large number, 250 to 600, or 100 is actually plus or minus 10%, 96, which is not bad if it's a really good sample, clean sample. And you need good questions. Even if you have the first 2 and you ask bad questions, how great are we? Great or really great? Make sure that's our post-survey question, by the way, Michelle.
Right.
That's garbage. So you're missing the important answers that people might want to give. Okay, so meetings. Think about a meeting. Sufficiently large numbers. Representative participation. Constructive and informed input. Okay, so that fails. Obviously, all 3. And if you go through things like emails, are they representative? We got 95 emails, a real example. 86 against. Turned out there was not a majority against this thing. Posters representative of non-posters on social media, especially on Nextdoor. Are users representative of non-users? This is just one example of town. Most people were actually over here who participated. That's their own map. No, not representative of all the people over here. And use responders representative of non-responders in online surveys. Hey, 85% are in favor of the community center. Actually, only 33%. But guess what? Those noisy people, the people that participated, they follow the topics they're interested in. They know what's going on. They participate in the topic because of their interest, and they tell their friends, the like-minded friends, to participate. So, and the motivated ones will participate multiple times. There's a name for that kind of a sample. It's a snowball sample. right? They tell two friends and so on and so on. And that's why you end up with junk data there. So don't do those. But scientific mailed surveys, you can do them yourself, postcards, letters. It's gotten a lot easier. One trick to watch out for, however, that's 16% of Americans that are over 65. Guess what they do when they get a survey? They take it. 50% of your responses will come from older people. So make sure you have demographics in there. Okay, so another one, scientific phone surveys. They've gotten a lot more expensive. They used to be 10 to 15 grand. Now they're like 30 for decent samples because of the cell phone. Here's why. What do you think the response rate was to a random digit dial survey in 1980? 72%, really good. Like you're getting your random sample and now your responses within that are representative of that random sample. 2000, 20 years ago, still really good. What do you think it is today? Think about it, and yeah. Do you answer any phones? No. So that's become a real challenge. Who actually answers phones? Perfectly random sample, but your response rate within that changes the game. So scientific panels, this is why a lot of leading research, Pew, Gallup, and so on, Harris has been doing it for a while. They do scientific panels, and smartphone ownership has rocketed from the birth of the iPhone in 2005 from 2% to 77 a couple of years ago. It's over 80 now. There's an upfront effort to create a good panel. You need to make sure it really is random, uncorrelated, and uncorrelated to the topic that you need. And you got to track potential biases over time potentially as well, but you can get real data real fast. In fact, if you do a comparison nowadays, phone is kind of on the expensive and fast. Mail is expensive and slow. Panels are running away. And this is, Michelle told me to mention what we do. Here's your 5-second pitch. There it is. All right, we saw this chart. We said, oh my gosh, we need to bring modern technology to local governments. They need this. So super fast, super affordable, 48 hours. Blank, you just missed it. Okay.
How many people are on a panel? How are they selected? I mean, tell us a little bit about what does that mean, finding a representative panel?
Sure. I'll give you the quick answer now, and if it's of interest, we can follow up in questions. But basically, you want hundreds of people, and you get a high response rate. So a typical panel might be 500 to 1,000 people, and you might get a 50 to 70% response rate in 48 hours. So you have good data from these people that are essentially on call to give you representative input. Good enough for now?
Yeah, and does that mean when you related that to cell phones, are you doing these panel surveys via cell phones?
So we actually use a multi-mode. So we do email, text, and phone, so it's fully inclusive, also multilingual. But other people will do different things. Some people will give people devices to use.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. So that community preferences, we've covered it. There's ways to get good data, and actually in questions, I can give you some specific tips. Ask me about my bait and switch survey trick that you guys can use. So individual now, here's the key thing about it. You always want it, actually, but it's got to be new, true, and for you. So if you already know it, it's not helpful. It's not new. If it's not true, it's not helpful, unfortunately. And if it's about someone else's responsibilities, if it's a county road and there's a pothole, it's not helpful. You can pass it on. You need all three, though. If any one of those are missing, it's noise. And that's your checklist for what am I hearing and listening to. Didn't know it. Okay, so, pothole at Main and First, didn't know it. New, true, that's our street. I used the bike lane. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Second report of the same pothole, not so much. You already knew it. Community wants more bike lanes. How do you know, right? So you can use that kind of a framework. Everybody's sitting in a meeting, getting emails, social media, use it. You'll love it. Okay. So how are the specific ways to get this kind of feedback? You know what? You can ask open-ended questions on surveys or any other tool you want. Anyone know a good pizza place? Any ideas you have? What would you change, right? Suggestions, facts, ideas, all that stuff. Again, get an excavator. What are you trying to do? You're going to throw out your back. You're too old for this, right? But just never ask preference questions because it's total garbage. Who makes the best pizza? Should we build a field or a playground? Should we change recycling? Everything. That data you get, unless you do it in an appropriate scientific way, it's going to be misleading. Okay, so how supportive are you of a measure? This is a sample question. No good. This is a survey monkey, not to pick on anyone in particular. Junk data, individual preference. However, are there any additional considerations that should be addressed? Things we haven't thought of? Great question. Do it. Go crazy with that. And use every tool you have. I was trying to think of the opposite of a warning label, so I made a go for it label. But it's basically meetings, complaints. They're all good. Any way that a fact, someone in another state could give you some useful piece of information. That's why we actually try to keep, surveys open, have that open piece, because you never know what might come in. But not for community preferences. Hammer it home. Never attempt to use. And in particular, oh my gosh, friends, do not let friends use SurveyMonkey for decision data. Do not attempt to use. Great for small groups that are similar, uniform, employees, tennis players, but or for amusement. Okay, so which channels for which input? Got your facts, you got your checklist, new, true, and for you. Great, it's useful. You got your community preference checklist, large number, not self-selected, good questions. Here you go. So, and you can take this home with you. Basically, can't interact with surveys, can't do preferences with all the engagement tools. Otherwise, there you line it up. And then if you want the expanded guide, got one for you. Okay, so the last answer to the quick poll is, actually, you can use online polls and surveys to get some good data, but it's all facts and ideas. And you would never use it for preferences because you get horrible data that can actually cost you millions. So with that, ask me anything else. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.
I don't know if you guys hung in.
So folks, if you feel free to send a question in chat or the Q&A, but Kevin, I think one of the things that I think many of us struggle with in local communities is finding ways to be able to get that scientific data. So understand the panel idea, understand, legitimate scientific polls. What about the people who say, yeah, but how do we afford to do that? And in the wake of that, what do we do? Right? It's a cost issue. So
I actually did prepare a few extra slides in case someone asked, because I wanted to make sure we covered that. So thank you for asking. I don't know if that was your own question or someone else's, but it's a great question. So I'm going to give you a couple, don't use these too often, but hey, come take the community center survey. Well, you're going to get junk about the community center data, but what if you had some other questions in there? And maybe it's something completely in left field, like, oh, hey, do you recycle used oil? Or something unrelated. So now you've got an uncorrelated sample for that particular question. The rest of the data is junk, but you can get some gauge of what does this slice of these people look like, as long as you know you're sampling. So that's a good trick to do. Another one is the kind of the uncorrelated intercept sample. And that sounds fancy, right? But it basically, I was talking with someone, a person in a really small town of 500 people was asking me, and I said, you got a store in town that everyone goes to? And he was like, oh yeah, we actually have a restaurant that everyone goes to, one restaurant. Just ask people there. Intercept them, right? They're not there because of an interest in that topic. And I put some pictures up here, but basically, this meeting you have, that's by a sample. If it's about, pickleball or something. At the Home Depot, may not be, it's not a uniform sample, it's not a random sample, but it's not biased towards your topic probably, unless the topic has something to do with construction and permits or whatever. So that's okay. Or a restaurant. Somewhere where regular people all go. Is that helpful?
It is, and I think the point is, as long as you say that doesn't reflect the entire community, that makes sense. Because
it's not perfect. Yeah. And no data is perfect, no sample is perfect. You just have to be aware of, what are the biases, how big are they likely to be. We've actually started, the margin of error that you always hear about is, we started calling that minimum error, because that is literally the best you could possibly do with a perfect random sample and 100% response rate of that random sample, and no one is doing that anywhere. But you know, the kind of differences we're looking for are pretty huge. I mean, when you're talking, is it 85 in favor or 33% in favor? And you can actually get at that with a relatively small number of high quality data points.
Perfect. Well, Kevin, we are right at the top of the hour. I do want to mention to folks, Kevin, go ahead and put up that last slide that has your contact information on there.
Please.
So there we
Love
go. If
this
you want to
stuff.
reach out, yeah, if you want to reach out to Kevin, that is his email. I would tell you he's good about responding back to emails. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. I also wanted to mention that I'm proud of 3CMA. We kind of follow Kevin's role and how he's laid things out. When we make decisions, like the recent decisions about annual conference and Savvy, that was based on direct feedback from our members. And so we take that to heart too, and appreciate those of you who take the time to respond to give us that kind of feedback. So our thanks to you all for tuning in. We're going to keep bringing you some great presentations. Kevin, thank you. I know you put a lot of work into making this simple and understandable. I think you did a bang-up job. So thank you so much.
Thanks, and give me your feedback. My favorite question, what'd you like least? That's how we make things better. It's my ninja question for you. I'll leave you with that. Appreciate it, everyone. Thanks so much for your time.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll be back in touch. Take care.